Hello, Ian. Buenos dias.
Buenos dias. Very good to see you again.
Yes, same
Yes,
here. All right. Chapter 24, Space and
yes.
Matter today.
Mm, mm.
Hmm.
Yes, I include matter in the title of two chapters because I wanted to illuminate two aspects of matter. One was its essentially spatial nature.
Yeah.
It actually has a temporal element as well, which is interesting. Um, and of course, the relationship with consciousness is a whole different topic. But space is such a contrast with time. It's a difficult one to pin down. I like
Yes.
the fact that my colleague and friend Jan Zwicky, the philosopher, made the point that we often see representations of time in paintings,
Hmm.
but to her knowledge, there has never been a representation of space. There isn't a sort of a person who represents space, where there is a person that represents time, either with a scythe or with a blade, breaking things down,
Hmm.
looking like a figure that is domineering. I mean, that's the feeling about time, that it's irresistible, and it's like another will that is driving you, whether you want it or not. Whereas space
Hmm.
has none of this at all. We can move where we want in space. Time is irreversible. Space offers a place for things to come into being and offers them some permanence, whereas time is always moving them away and helping them towards decay.
Yes. To put it simply, I would say time is a harder topic we just covered, but while reading this chapter, I realized that space is a kind of tentative topic.
Mm.
I don't know if that makes sense to say that.
In what way do you mean tentative?
Mm. So you approach it here. We'll cover it. Like you speak about form, about depth and water again. Very interesting. And from form, we can talk about information and also the emptiness and so on. And it's all in a way there, but especially at the end when you discuss the approach from physics. Um,
Mm. Mm.
we don't really know what space is, and also, but it's it's all over the place, but we don't know what it is.
Yes. Well, it's the other thing, one can't think of motion without. So time and space are required for there to be motion. And we've agreed that a very profound idea is that motion is at the core of being, that being involves some
Yes,
kind of movement. Yeah.
it's space more something more not discrete in the sense of continuous and discrete, but something that's more in a way invisible and to a side. I mean, I'm personalizing it, but yes, time has this constant presence and space is there, but it's maybe kind of in the background.
Yes. Well, that's right. I mean, that actually is one of the interesting hemisphere differences, is that the left hemisphere doesn't seem to see the background. It only sees whatever is foregrounded. It sees the thing that is salient as of
Mm,
interest to it. And it's the right hemisphere that sees and gives that background. And in that sense, makes things cohere and have meaning, because, of course, it's only when they're put back into that context where there is a background to which whatever it is you're paying attention is the
mm,
foreground, that that foreground has its meaning.
yeah, yeah. So far we've learned from you, from what you write in the book, that there are no things, and that things are not in space or time, right? So that maybe
Mm.
one, as we often do, well, in order to talk about what something is, we could say what it's not. And space, you're right, is not a container, right?
Yes,
Mm.
yes. And that is really Einstein's point. It's better to say that things are spatially extended. It's an aspect of their being that they are
Mm.
spatially extended, rather than invent a new noun, space. And
Mm.
I applied the same thinking to the idea of being things being temporally extended.
Mm.
rather than existing in a container called time, or in a kind of even in a flow, because that makes the flow contain them. And when we were talking about time, I was making the point that what exists is part of that flow. It's not something separate that happens to find itself in a flow. It is an expression of the flow. So we come back to the unhelpfulness of the idea of things. Yes, that's true.
Yes.
Yes.
Now,
the thrust, gone.
No, go ahead, please.
No, I was just going to say, but in a way, the interesting thing about space is, I think, its relationship to matter. Because we can't imagine matter without it having some sort of a form. And that brings us to the question of what form is. But it seems absolutely fundamental to all material things. One could say it's foundational and essential to all the things that we can imagine that are not primarily material. But I think it's more obvious that material things can't have forms. So it can't exist without having forms. And people sometimes say, well, you can't have forms without matter, but I don't think that's quite right. You can have forms in your imagination. You can see forms in patterns of light. Form doesn't have to be material, but matter has to have form. So matter seems dependent on space, but space and the shapes of space, which are very interesting things, these fields, these Gestalten, these forms, what are they? They don't seem to be. They seem to be not dependent for their existence on matter.
Is form then more fundamental than space in a way? And also when we'll discuss the physics of space, yes.
Yes, because as I say, it is possible to conceive of matter without form. It's impossible to think of matter without form, but it is possible to think of form without matter. And so it seems that at least form is more primal than matter. Whether it's more primal than space, I don't know. Perhaps there's no way to answer that question, and perhaps it's a question that doesn't need to be answered. I don't know.
Especially
but forms are an aspect. Aspect of space.
I'm mentioning this because, as you know, there are all these views today where rather than matter, space, or energy, information is postulated as really the ground of quote unquote being in physics, like the idea of it from bit. So I was wondering whether there's kind of a logical thread here to say, well, form is more primal than matter, and therefore maybe information could be at the bottom of matter and space, but probably is a bridge too far again.
Well, no, maybe that's right, because I think it depends terribly what one means by information. I'm always a bit uneasy when the emphasis is laid on information, because it makes it sound like the series of zeros and ones that could build up a kind of instruction to a computer. But I think that what we're looking at, I think the important part of the word information is form, which is actually not necessary and not even present in a string of commands. Form is something different, and all through the book and based on hemisphere differences, I'm making a distinction between the very limited serial way in which the left hemisphere operates according to a series of elements that are strung together. Could be instructions, could be information, could be whatever. But the right hemisphere is seeing a whole that doesn't necessarily only show motivation or energy or drive from somewhere at the bottom of this structure leading forwards or upwards, but actually in the whole of the structure, the form. And that idea and this idea that, gosh, I wish there was a word in English for it, but there isn't, of the Gestalt. This is just so fundamental, so important. This idea of a form that cannot be degraded into bits or parts, which is another reason that I'm slightly anxious about. I know there are meanings of information, but people don't always make clear what they do mean by information. And so it's a dangerous word, in fact, unless one is very clear about what one is meaning and what one is excluding.
Yes, and it perhaps something occurred to it as with the word the word thing we covered on the previous chapter, like form is a very powerful idea. In form, like form within maybe, but then information now has been, it's kind of this path has been trodden in so many ways that it has really lost that core concept of form that perhaps Gestalt could recuperate.
That's right, and it's not the only disadvantage of dealing with the word information, because in our ability to comprehend the world, I think there is a hierarchy. It's certainly a way of using language, an important and common one, to differentiate between mere information, the gathering of data, and knowing, which is something more cognitive that one does with the data. And even that is not understanding. And even understanding is not wisdom. So at the bottom of this hierarchy of being able to make sense of the world is information. And it really only comes into its own when it's taken up into knowledge, into understanding, and finally into wisdom. So I have a number of problems with the word. I don't deal with this topic actually in the book. I just tend to steer clear of it.
Yes.
Because I don't see the necessity to use the term actually.
Yes, that's also why I wanted to bring it up, so that at least you could say some things about it, because it's all over the place in the mind sciences, in the life sciences, and now in the physical sciences. Like, it's in a way, matter and energy, you could say, were fashionable in the 19th century, then the 20th century did some weird stuff on our understanding of them, and then cybernetics came, and now information is the new precious metal, right?
Yes. Well, cybernetics, unfortunately, has had a pernicious effect on science, on life sciences particularly. So, yeah, I would suggest that it's much more fruitful to deal with rich terms, which are not, for that reason, easily specifiable, like matter, depth, form, energy in space. These still seem to me to be rich concepts, i.e. they're concepts which can be taken further, can be made sense of, and don't seem to collapse into just the same thing. More data.
So please tell us about depth. Depth appears again, and you really draw from the sea, not just water, but the sea. It's really beautiful. Please tell us about that.
Oh, well, thank you. Yes. Well, I was intrigued by a remark by Isaiah Berlin that depth is an important concept that philosophy rarely deals with. And it's not that one can't deal with it, it's just that it's somehow unaddressed. And he makes the point that it's a very important one that can't be replaced by anything else. When we call something deep, we don't just mean that it's complex or beautiful or hard to understand. It could be all of those things, but it's something else which interestingly relates to the three-dimensional, because again, one of the differences between the hemispheres is that the right hemisphere sees with depth in space and in time. So depth in time, I think we possibly talked about, I can't remember now, but depth in time is the idea of extension from where you are backwards or forwards in time, which gives a context to where one is and makes clear that time is always on the move, is flowing. It's not a kind of entity somewhere. And in space, this idea of depth is very important because it conjures something different that I think we may have lost the sense of in modern culture. I mean, it's not a term that's often used now. Things that works of art are archetypally said to be powerful these days. I mean, it's extraordinary. One imagines Michelangelo finishing the Sistine Chapel and the Pope coming in and saying, "Powerful work, Michelangelo." I don't think so. This is because power is the only value that we seem to have nowadays in order to deal with any of our problems, philosophically, socially, or in any other. It's all about power. But in fact, there is something else about depth, which is the contact with something hard to express that matters enormously, that gives meaning to whatever it is. And you're right that I can't remember the exact detail now because I did research all the etymology, but there is a strong relationship between the idea of the deep, which I think goes back to Greece, to ancient Greece, of the deep as the sea. And it comes forward so that in English, the deep also became the sea early on, 1,000 years ago. Probably this exists in most languages because it is our fundamental image of something that is deep. But also it was used by the Greeks for things that are immense and sublime. So a deep cliff or a deep mountain, which means what we would probably call a steep cliff or a steep mountain. But this was a concept of something that was, I think an essential element of it is something that touches awe, wonder, a sense of something beyond exactly what we can grasp. Certainly when one uses the word deep to describe a work of art or thought or so on, that is what one's getting at. And it survives in things like the expression, which I love, because I love rural France, la France profonde, the deep France, where you go into this, it's something, some expression of that sort of feeling of a leisurely unfolding of a luxurious landscape into which one can easily pass. So I think it's lovely.
And also it may evoke the idea that there is, and it's true that there is, especially when talking about the sea, a lot explored, a lot to explore, but it can also be turned around, and you mentioned it, some sort of unfathomable. So it's not just that there's a lot of it. It's quite deep. That there are many layers to it. It's not just that there are many layers. That the problem, we cannot cover them all.
No. That's right. And another thing that's important about it is that in Greek, bathos was used to express a number of things. Depth in space, as well as sort of the up and down, but just like an army that was deep in ranks, that was a very powerful force. And also fields were deep in wheat, forests were deep. A woman's hair could be said to be deep because it was luxuriant, and this idea of fertility is bound up in the deep, as though what is living comes out of somewhere that is very deep into a space.
Yes. An exuberance.
And that space is...
Yeah, an exuberance that has to do
exuberance.
With this different understanding of... so there's no such thing as empty space. If we talk about emptiness, which you also talk about, has to do with receptivity. So it's a very particular kind of...
Yes. Well, while you were saying it, I was just thinking, of course, uber in Latin is the womb. So exuberance is something to do with this fertile space. And, you know, I've often commented on this interesting idea that we get from Sanskrit and it's in Buddhism, of emptiness as this great achievement to experience emptiness. But we tend to think of emptiness as just negation. It just means there's nothing there. Whereas what this is an enormously rich potential. It's slightly like one of those tensions that I've talked about between, the string that is pulled in both directions but has potential for a note to come forth, or an arrow to fly forth from the bow. The potential space in the womb is a space where things can grow. And I understand that the root of the word shunyata, which is this emptiness that is striven for in meditation and is a form of wisdom, has the same root as a word svi or sva, which means swelling in Sanskrit, and that it's like the swelling seed in which all that is to come forth, the plant, is contained in potential and is to come out, and the womb is a similar image of this space. And that is very, very important. It might be worth mentioning here the concept of ma in Japanese, which I talk about. In Japanese aesthetics, and in philosophy in general, not just in aesthetics, this concept of ma. And ma is something that is very important for the understanding of the world. And what is ma? Ma is a sort of potential space, a betweenness that is generative. So it's what's not stated, what's not filled, what's not fully expressed in a spatial arrangement. And I believe that the ideogram in Japanese for ma shows a door and the sun. And so it's like a doorway, and the sun is coming in through the cracks around them between the doors. And that idea is rather a lovely one. And they say that people who don't have ma are fools. I can't remember the word, manake or something like that. There is a word in Japanese which means a fool, and it's derived from not having any ma. And since, as it's often been pointed out, we don't have a word for ma, at least in English, then we're all potentially fools here.
It reminds me of this famous phrase, right? There's a quote, there's a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in.
Gets in, yes, exactly, yes, very good.
And this is, you relate these ideas to relata, which is, I think, one of the fundamental ideas of your whole book, at least one that you consistently want to expound and subvert or invert the hierarchy of how we've been taught to think about stuff, about the matters with things.
Yes, that's right, yes. No, you're right, it is fundamental, and it was already there in implicate form in The Master and His Emissary, where I referred to this concept of betweenness, which is often misunderstood. It's not a rapport, exactly, although that's a lovely thing in itself, nor is it a space between. It's what comes out of the coming together of two things. That's something new, which takes up into itself and alters in order to bring forth something new, both the elements, or the multiple elements it might be, and the spaces and relations between them, and the newness of the object. So it's a complex idea, and it's related to the Hegel's idea of Aufhebung, the sublation. It's not a good translation, but that's how it's conventionally translated, but the raising up of things when they come into union or into conjunction. So yes, this idea of the relation is extraordinarily important, and the simplest way to think of it, because people are puzzled by the idea that how can there be relations without the things that are related, but the things that we see as related are only what they are because of the relationships they are in. So clearly their relatedness is part of what they are. and they only are what they are in those relations. So from a quite logical point of view, the relationships are what build the thing. And in that sense, relations are prior to relata.
Yeah.
And I think what I love is that in writing this book, I discovered a physicist actually sent to me a paper by a colleague, which was called There Are No Things, which was originally the title of this book, until I realized that that would align me with a pernicious form of postmodernism that I thoroughly reject, which just says there is no truth and there is no reality, we make it all up. So, but anyway, it's good that physicists confirm David Mermin, I think first in 1990 or thereabouts, this idea that the relata are prior to, the relations are prior to the relata.
Let's weave this idea with your image of the spring or the rope pulled, and maybe meditate on the word extension. I wanted to ask about extension, right? Because it also has the idea of extension and maybe relata. But when we're talking, or when you're writing about space and matter, which we'll talk about a little bit, but basically space, it's extension what we're trying to understand here, right? What is extension?
Yes.
So help us here.
What a lovely thing to raise. Because, of course, the root of attention, intention, extension are all from tendere in Latin, which means to stretch out a hand. So what they all contain in them is a sense of a movement outwards towards a goal, towards another thing, towards another entity. And so in an obvious way, one can see that attention has this quality, intention has this quality, and extension is lovely if we think of it in this way, because once again we see it come to life and be a movement, a relation that is not a static thing. We can think of extension in a very Newtonian way as belonging to a static universe, but it isn't actually. And I commented yesterday that there's something mysterious and foundational about extension, which is fundamental to both time and space, that they are extended, that things are extended in time, extended in space. What is this extension? Because you cannot get there from a point. You can. It's something new.
Yes. And Bergson talks a lot about this tension as an arrow, and especially when it comes to time. And he even implies, as I understand, that if you relax this tension, that's how you get matter in a way. You go from memory to matter if you relax that tension. So maybe that's a way to unify both space and time.
That's a very interesting concept that I haven't really taken on board fully, I don't think. Yes. Because memory has in it a form of extension. It is a kind of extension. It's a sense of continuity of what we know within this way of thinking that we have, where time flows and connects. And what I think about matter is, yes, perhaps that it is a slackening of that tension. What is interesting to me about matter is that it represents a degree of permanence and resistance. So it's resistance to the flow of time. Matter is something that says, hang on, I have a purpose here for a while.
Yes.
And of course, everything is moving and changing. Of course, all matter is in flux. But nonetheless, for a while, it makes a certain element have coherence for longer.
Yeah. And I think that's exactly how Bergson would conceive matter, now in opposition or in contrast with life, you know. Matter is that resistance that in a way difficult, but also allows for life to differentiate. And I think we've discussed this in a way.
Absolutely. Yes, we couldn't ever have individuals and individual beings.
Yes.
And, you know, again, it's like, you know, as I mentioned, that friction is both what stops motion and what enables motion. That matter is both what makes our life limited and likely to decay, but makes it also something that persists in a certain form.
And how beautiful is it that one can attempt a metaphysics where one is using these very everyday-like concepts like tension, attention, intention, again, to bring Bergson again, when he discusses this very difficult point about how we remember things. He speaks about contraction. I mean, it's all about these kinds of movement. Like a dancer would just get them all, and he's using those again, those movements to talk about the metaphysics of space and time and memory and so on.
Yes. Well, I suppose that once one takes music out of being simply extended in time and thinks of it as extended in space, you have dance. I mean, dance is the expression of music in space, and of course, in a deeply embodied way. And embodiment, of course, involves the coming into being of space. Once again, it's that material element. So there's a very, very close relationship, I believe, between space and matter, which is why I thought that, one needed to think about matter twice, once in relation to space and once in relation to consciousness. Yeah.
What a deep link here you made between music and dance in this quite profound way. And also in this chapter you write about music. You say harmony in music is the equivalent orally of spatial depth. We've discussed that,
yes.
but I found this remark so rich. Tell us more about it, please.
Well, there are two ways, I think, of thinking about spatial depth. And there's a common trope in modern cultural philosophy that suggests that somehow perspective embodies and enhances the idea of a detached observer. And I think that's an interesting idea, but it seems to me very one-sided, because what visual depth offers is far more, it seems to me, than detachment, connection, that here is a space into which you are invited to move and into which you can reach and make contact. So that depth always brings together the possibility of more and the sense of not being with, but also being with potentially. It's like, it's wonderful to think of this in terms of the poetry of Wordsworth, because Wordsworth is constantly showing how connection with other people and with other moments in time brings up a sort of longing, but that longing is not just a sort of disabling melancholy. It's a sort of sense of enticement to make contact, and it's a sense of being with and not being with. In this sense, it's like Donne's wonderful poem of the compasses. He uses the image of a pair of compasses so that the point of the compass is in the middle and the pencil goes around the circle. I remember this at school. Probably school children no longer have compasses. But anyway, he gives this idea because that when he goes away from his mistress, from his love, that he is circling her and that the two parts, the arms of the compass, are connected and lean together as this dance goes on. So it is lovely. But of course, the point about longing is that it comes from a Saxon root, langian in Old English, and langian means to stretch out. So there again, this idea of longing in depth, in space and time, is already present. But what I so I wanted to say that I think depth is this idea of visual depth. It relates to the feeling in music of harmony, because in harmony you're invited not to sit with one line only, but to allow yourself to be stretched between one line and other lines that beautifully dance with the original line and create ever new relations between them. And it's out of this relatedness in sound and out of the relatedness in space that we come to experience this rich, complex beauty. And it's often said that perspective was first used by Giotto, who was an early Italian Renaissance painter, and was first demonstrated by Brunelleschi in 1415. But it wasn't, actually. The Greeks knew perspective. The Romans knew perspective. All civilizations seem independently to have come to well, not all, but certainly the Greek and Roman. I don't think the Egyptians ever mastered perspective. But the Greeks and Romans certainly mastered perspective, and we see paintings that are in perspective. And famously, a Greek painter, Zeuxis, was supposed to be able to paint things so realistically in 3 dimensions. He would paint fruit, and birds would come and try and peck at the fruit. What interests me is that harmony came into music with the Renaissance at the time that perspective came in again, and then went out in the 20th century. Harmony and perspective were not so much lost as deliberately torn up by modernism, which is interesting because there are many, many parallels between the phenomena of modernism and right hemisphere deficits, which I explain in one of the chapters in The Master and His Emissary. But since I wrote that, other researchers have shown exactly the same thing, that the elements that were so much prized by modernism in art, in visual art, are archetypally right hemisphere deficits. So I'm pleased that other people have seen this too.
And let's go into this in a minute, but incidentally, let me remark that the publisher of your book is Perspectiva, isn't it?
Yes, good one. I like it. Yes, and of course, what they're talking about there is being able to adopt different perspectives, which is love, and to see things in perspective. Both very, very important, and things that we don't do. So, if I could say what is wrong with public discourse at the moment, nobody takes different perspectives, and nopody sees things in perspective, gets them in perspective. They get them out of perspective. Yeah.
Yes. It's kind of a flatland where the only possibility of encounters is by a kind of intersection of planes and seeking for agreement. It's very strange, right? It's just maybe because 2 intersecting planes give you a line. Now, with respect to Flatland, I wanted to also reflect and ask you, let's go back to, because you mentioned this about music and harmony, and we were discussing about depth. It's very telling that we spend our days we're doing it right now in front of a computer and tablets. Everything is flat. And it has to do, and at the same time, culture has become very superficial, with surfaces, and also about reflecting, but not about refracting, which is what depth allows. I wanted to throw these things at you because I think metaphorically, at least, they are telling us something. We've collapsed the depth into the surface, both technologically, but also culturally and psychologically.
Yes, and hence the culture has, in my view, lost depth. A point that's made by a publishing success by Nick Carr, a book called The Shallows, what has happened to our lives in the age of the internet. Yeah. So, yes, and it is important that the right hemisphere sees depth, but the left hemisphere tends to flatten things. And you see this in schizophrenia, which, for the umpteenth time, I point out, is like a condition of right hemisphere failure and left hemisphere compensatory overdrive. That subjects describe the living world as being like one describes it as being like a sheet. He feels that if he pulled his hand up to the top right corner and tore downwards, he would pull off a sheet, that it's just flat. And some people describe it as they're walking into a flat wall. They don't actually feel the depth of space anymore. And also in sound, they don't feel the depth, which is really intriguing in the view of that. And that there are other elements that happen to space in schizophrenia and in right hemisphere deficits. Of course, we've been over the fact that space becomes fragmented, but it also has this lack of depth and continuity. It also becomes obsessed with symmetry and obsessed with geometricism. So if you look at the paintings of subjects with schizophrenia, a topic that one day I want to write a book about, because he did that. The paintings are wonderful and so revealing. That they have a sort of morbid symmetry and a morbid geometricism about them, which is remarked on in patients with schizophrenia and also patients with right hemisphere compromising conditions like OCD and anorexia nervosa, which I touch on briefly in the book. But I think it's worth, while we're just discussing this, to talk about an experiment done in the 50s where hypnotizable subjects, susceptible subjects, were hypnotized so that they were to feel the sense of depth. So, okay, they did. When they went out into the world, either in a car or walking, they felt this sense of depth. And what they describe is like being, it's the nearest thing to being on acid. You know, the world is so beautiful. I cannot express how rich, how live, how beautiful it is. So this shows so clearly the connections between beauty, depth, connectivity, and the living on the one hand, and the flatness, the meaninglessness, the emptiness in the negative sense of the world when it is flattened out.
Yes. And in psychedelic research and also in fundamental physics, one way, or the main way to try to revitalize or enrich what we're trying to cast into the world, or how we're trying to make sense about the world, is the idea of dimensions and expanding dimensions, right?
Yes. No, exactly. And that's perhaps another point worth making, that you can have any number of dimensions to space. Possibly 11, possibly 13. I find it hard to conceive of more than 4, but there we are. I expect everyone is in the same boat. But you can, as David Tong says, there is only one single unity in physics, and that is time. Can be only one dimension of time. If time were to have more than one dimension, it would cease to be time. So that is another interesting thing about the contrast between time and space.
Yeah, on this note here, for instance, I think Bernard Carr, who you probably know,
I do,
has this hyperdimensional theory that actually tries to go beyond physics, not just in terms of extending what is needed to be extended in order to make sense of relativity and quantum physics, but also to include mind and soul, you could say, and so on. And if I remember correctly, he proposes another extra dimension for time. And I think it's an attempt to have the virtual or the possible in conjunction with the actual, what has happened, but still what could happen. So sometimes some of these spatial dimensions are borrowed for time, but it's time specialized nevertheless.
I think that has to be the case, and I suppose that, I mean, I couldn't conceivably take issue with Bernard, who's a great physicist, and I'm blatantly not. But I would have thought that there are other ways, certainly, of accommodating the idea of potential without having an extra dimension to time. Anyway, yes.
Well, I was just making the point about dimensions, and another thing that's very important in physics, since you devote the last part of this chapter to physics, is this notion of a phase space. I wanted to mention that too. And a phase space is kind of an abstraction of space as we know it, and it's basically that space, again, where all possible states of, in that case, a dynamical system can be represented. And so, all possible. So again, now the possible is collapsed into something that's actual, because you could see them there, and each of those states is a point. So here we're doing all the many things we know metaphysically we shouldn't be doing, but in physics it's so useful and convenient to have phase spaces. Yes,
that's a good point. And yes, I do go on to talk a bit about physics. It's a difficult area. But I think what I bring to it is, as usual, what light can be thrown by the hemisphere hypothesis. and I wanted to, perhaps we could finish our discussion by talking about the issues that I want to raise there, which I believe I can offer some possibilities for. Let me put it no stronger than that. And they do depend again on the visions of the two hemispheres, because I ask these questions: to what extent are the physical foundations of reality knowable? If so, what do they look like? In particular, are they discrete or continuous? And then I ask, what clues do we have about the nature of mass and matter? Big questions. And is asymmetry built into the foundations of reality in the way that it seems to be in our brain? So, yes. I mean, the first thing to say is that what we seem to know about reality as it can be in any sense grasped by physics is that it does have right hemisphere-like qualities rather than left hemisphere-like qualities. It's intrinsically uncertain, not just incidentally uncertain at the moment. It is intrinsically uncertain, intrinsically imprecise, and intrinsically context defined. So it has those qualities which suggest that the right hemisphere is more likely to be able to give a good account of the physics of matter and space than the left. What do you think about that, Alex?
Well, I was going one step back and thinking that
go on.
Let's go one step back, because you made that point that so we are trying to talk about physics, and so I must make a disclaimer here. I'm a physicist, but that doesn't mean I'm an expert in space-time or like this high energy physics. It's like saying, well, if you're a biologist, maybe you're a developmental biologist and you know what you need to know about evolution, but you're not an evolutionary biologist, right? Having said that, it's very interesting to me that you and I perhaps we could find the place where you say that you say something like that. You're going to risk saying things knowing that it's not your expertise and that you're probably going to be wrong, but nevertheless those things should be said. And then there's another idea here, which is from psychiatry and neurology, and also from philosophy. You attempt to contribute to fundamental physics, and at least that's how I see it. And also physics can contribute. So it's like a triple hand of Escher, that maybe it's not drawing the other, but it's coloring it or making some detail here and there. And so just to emphasize, maybe that's not what you were asking, but there's a zoom out. And that's true transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary thinking. And these words are often used as labels to get crowns or attention. But we should dare, a psychiatrist should dare to offer deep insights to the physicists, not only the physicists being at the bottom, which has to do with building blocks, again, this idea of building blocks, telling upwards how to think about the brain and so on, but also in this other direction. So sorry, that derailed a bit where you were going.
No.
I was still at that high level.
No, thank you for adverting to that, and I think the word dare is is right. I mean, it is. I make no bones about it. It is taking a risk, as you say. But I believe very strongly with Whitehead that physics and metaphysics need to come together to help one another, and that the divorce between them is a mistake. But what is somebody like me, who is not a trained physicist, supposed to do about that? If I want to talk about these metaphysical questions, I need to try and put forward some ideas that I feel I can see on the basis of, and I mentioned the names of, 8 or 10 physicists whose work I can begin to understand, and what I glean from that. Yes.
Maybe there's another remark to make here, and probably it's in every field and sub-discipline, but I also try to follow some of that literature, probably not through the primary sources like articles and so on, maybe through books and interviews. And well, it's confusing. Maybe that's a good sign. Because they are really trying to figure it out. It's not like, well, there are these, and neuroscience is a little bit similar. It's different in other ways, because I don't think we really have theories that stand like physical theories, but it's a big mess. So it's really messy to talk about it, because you can have a really respectable physicist in this case, and you quote some of them, who will tell you, particles are fundamental. Another one, no, fields. Another one, no, that this doesn't make any sense. We need to go to a pre-spatial domain, and so on. People should know that most of the time, science and philosophy, hopefully, it's in the making. It's in the making.
It's in the making. Yeah. It's yet another thing that is a process, that is in becoming.
That's what I said, by the way, that I by reading this chapter, I found it. I said that at the beginning of our conversation, tentative. But I'm a Spaniard, so maybe that's not easily translatable. But this idea that it's uncertain in a really profound and disturbing way. Like, I had the feeling like probably all of that is true, or probably all of that is just like high resolution smoke, and none of that would survive in 20 or 30 years time. None of these ideas. Yes.
Well, of course, if we all said nothing until we knew that it would survive in 20 or 30 years time, nothing would be said. So it's I can be excused for making the attempt, I hope. What I'm really doing there is saying something I do have some knowledge of and expertise in, is the way in which the brain contributes to the grasp of reality through physics, and that this actually does help us not answer questions finally, of course, that's never going to happen, but to see that certain paths that physics might take are likely to be more fruitful than others. And I nail my colours to the mast on the matter of fields and so on by saying that I, for what it's worth, I owe an allegiance to quantum field theory. I think it's the most interesting, the most robust version that's going at the moment, and it has the advantage that it can be reconciled with Einstein's ideas, which quantum mechanics in its more conventional form can't.
And I see now what you're doing. Let me rephrase it. It's like in engaging with physics, you're betting on a right hemisphere-like kind of physics. Like, here we have all this myriad of ways. Well, if everything you've been writing is coherent and consistent, it's quite likely that we should favor, or at least explore with more hope, those physical theories that are more right-brainy in a way.
Well, that's right. I mean, that was the purpose of certainly part one, and to an extent part two of the book, was to say, when we actually come in part three to look at what can we know about these amazing ultimate imponderables, it seems likely that there will be different takes, and that one can see the hallmark of the left hemisphere on some and the hallmark of the right hemisphere on others. And we should be more likely to be sympathetic to the ones that have the hallmark of the right hemisphere. And you know, the word tentative takes us back to this idea of tenere, to reach out a hand. I'm reaching out. I'm not saying this is what it is. I'm just saying I'm groping towards something that seems to me to have meaning, a shape, a gestalt, which makes sense. Does this make sense to you physicists as you read it? That's all I'm saying.
Yes. Also tentacles, right? Because maybe we're grasping here and there. Yes. Because there can be many ways. There are many ways that are proposed. And again, this sociologically, it's interesting. Like, some physicists are harshly critiquing where string theory has gone over the last decades. Others say, so let's continue doing that. Others say, well, no, here's my new theory of everything. Others would be willing to expand and add as many dimensions, but the moment you try to bring in mind or consciousness, they don't want to know anything about it. It's like a wild jungle. It's very interesting, and probably we'll revisit this when we discuss consciousness, no? But why not? Why not the study of mind becoming kind of the key breaking point to both, in a way, I was going to say fix, but it's not fixed, in a way.
No.
Solve some of the, or resolve some of the big unknowns in physics at the same time that we're doing it for our own minds. It makes sense to me. This could happen.
Well, I'm glad it does seem to make sense. It does, obviously, to me, because there is this impossible to separate realm in which we do need to deal with physics and consciousness together. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I'm really trying to do in this this chapter.
And I like your remark that and the fact that you're including mass or matter, matter in when you discuss space. You have this special invited guest, which is matter. But when you discuss consciousness, matter will be there too. So please come. We're discussing these things. I think you're important in this discussion, and you're invited to several discussions.
I like that. Yes. Matter is our special guest who will make several appearances.
Isn't matter kind of the elephant in the room? Some people say it's consciousness, but I think it's matter. Matter is the metaphysical elephant in the room. It's like we all take it for granted. We have absolutely, I have absolutely no idea what that is.
Well, yes. Well, in physical terms, matter is whatever occupies space and has mass, or exists spatially, to avoid the locution in space. But it must have mass. And the thing that is so fascinating is that what physicists mean by mass is the tendency of an entity to resist changes in course or changes in speed. So it comes back to my metaphysical idea, exemplified here by physicists, that matter is fundamentally there as resistance in the whole, not resistance in a purely or even mainly negative sense, but one in which allows things to be brought forward. And, we need both continuity and discreteness together in the one picture, and that seems what we've got.
Let me raise the ante and say, well, somebody could ask, as listening to us, okay, Ian, when you're saying those things or writing those things about mass, are you talking as a psychiatrist, as a neurologist, as a philosopher, as a physicist? And the answer could be yes. It could be yes. Why do I say so? Because, well, you don't have a degree in physics, but I think in a way, you are doing physics as you're talking about those things. Let's take this example of mass, which reminded me that equation that an old professor of mine put on the whiteboard, which is kind of a mystery to contemplate, which was what fascinated me and still fascinates me about physics. He said, look, guys, inertial mass happens to be exactly the same than gravitational mass. What a mystery, right? They need not be the same, nevertheless they are. But then in your chapter, you discuss that one is this resistance, but the other one is this this drive to kind of meet the other. And somebody could say, oh, how beautiful, come on, let's calculate and shut up and calculate. But no, to me, you're doing physics there.
Well, thanks. That was one of my more tentative offerings, but it is interesting that yes, the inertial aspect of mass tends towards separation, but the force of gravity tends towards connection. Tends, in fact, and sorry, go on.
No, I just another idea came to mind. I was thinking maybe some sort of, how could we call it, fictional philosophy, or it's science fiction in a way, but it's not science fiction. Like, we could imagine, entertain, that would be fun and interesting. What would happen to the world? And by the way, that's what many physicists do. They entertain possible universes and so on. What would happen to the matter with things if gravitational mass wasn't exactly equal to inertial mass? Because they cancel out. If you have Newton's laws and the force of gravitation, the M, you can cancel it out. And we do it all the time when you solve a simple problem, in high school even. Well, what would happen if those things weren't the same? what metaphysical implications would it have, and also for our daily lives,
Well, yes, that's definitely somewhere I can't risk treading.
Well, that's why I was invoking a different format, one when one is just in a more artistic way, and I mean it, like art is not, and and you totally agree, it's much more than entertainment or diversion, right? It can be like going deep, not being diverted, but really an invitation to go deep.
Yes. Well, that's a lovely thought. All I can hope is that I haven't wasted people's time by going into these areas, but it seemed to me that I had no alternative, and I am interested in them. And of course, I have a certain basic foundation in physics. I mean, it's part of being a scientist, and I needed that too. But I have never studied physics as a university subject. Yeah. But I have found it increasingly an interesting counterpoint, if you like, to metaphysics, and keep seeing bridges and wondering if there's something in them.
Let me make one other remark. So my daughters go to a Waldorf school, and one of the things they want to do there is, well, in a way, there's a program, but out of their own interest. So how amazing it is that, let's put an example, like they become interested in let's say, in drawing. Of course, the kids are naturally interested in drawing things, but then at some point they feel the urge to maybe write something, like the name of the friend for whom that drawing is, and then they want to learn handwriting. It's not like, okay, we're going to teach you this so that it's in your toolkit for whenever you need it. No, at some point you really need to know that. So in that case, you can start from neurology and then be interested in philosophy, and at some point you say, I need the physics now, and the way you approach the study of that physics, although it doesn't have a university degree, can be more profound and certainly more joyful than, well, yes, 20 years ago I went to university for 4 years,
Well, you've done an enormous amount of physics. You've got several degrees in physics, so that's remarkable. And that you were able to bridge that and neuroscience and be a practicing neuroscientist is just wonderful. It's why we're able to have these conversations. One needs people. I increasingly find that people who understand my work and who are neuroscientists, like neuroscientist Nina Kraus in Northwestern University in America, who I had a conversation with recently. It turns out that she started interested in cultural history and languages and then went into science, which makes her science so rich.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I had a curiosity. I don't want to finish without asking you, because I know for me who's the philosopher par excellence of time. And we don't need to mention his name again. Everybody that has been listening knows. What's the philosopher for you, par excellence, about space?
Oh gosh, that's a good one, isn't it? I don't think that there is one really for me. No, I mean, time is in a different league altogether. Yeah. But it's slightly like Jan Zwickie's remark that I referred to earlier, that there are many representations of time in paintings, but none of space. It's not something that I think of philosophers as talking about very much, actually.
You see?
That's very interesting.
It's like in the United States, you would ask who's your favorite baseball player, and they'll all propose 3 or 4 names. Now, what about cricket? And then you hear crickets, cricket. It's like, but how? I mean, space. Come on.
Is the one that you would name, Alex?
Maybe Aristotle.
Okay. Yes.
Because I'm interested in this distinction between place and space, which I think is key to biology. I'm in a weird place because my background is physics. I'm interested in the mind and consciousness, but I do it from a biological stance. So it's like I'm and also I'm like a Janus, here and here, and I think living organisms inhabit places more than spaces.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
So that, as you would say, that distinction is interesting in my own work. And I think Aristotle, spent some good lines about it.
Maybe so, yes. I mean, what I remember is I think it's Aristotle who says that everything that exists has its place. And place exists, so place must have its place. And this seems to be the left hemisphere going exactly down the wrong path, And I have immense respect for Aristotle, particularly as an empirical scientist. I mean, obviously, the science that he did is not science as we would now think of it, but he turned his mind to, interested in and observed so many things. And many of his conclusions are very helpful. But he did start a lot of trouble with the law of the excluded middle and
well, he didn't have 2 millennia of literature to read as we do. He was a bit of a disadvantage in the course of things. Well,
and an advantage.
Yes. Now, another one I would name is Whitehead, of course, but I haven't really read that part. I mean, he has his own theory of relativity, for instance, and so he's integrating his deep knowledge of mathematics and physics, and of course the cosmology that came after. But I could not say more than what I just said about Whitehead's understanding of space. But for instance, in Process and Reality, he has hardcore. Well, the whole book is hardcore, but he has hardcore chapters about extension and it's really difficult. I wish there was. I'm not sure if there is a single person today alive that can understand both the mathematics and the philosophy that Whitehead implies in those chapters. But that could be the philosopher we're looking for.
It could be the philosopher that we're missing at the moment. Yes. There we are. Yeah.
Well.
So perhaps I could just mention in conclusion that I think that the right hemisphere guides us to answers in physics. I've mentioned that the nature of our the knowability of reality, the right hemisphere is a better guide. And I mentioned that with mass and matter, it seems to fit very, very well into this right hemisphere model, that the coincidence of opposites, that we need both the resistance and the thing that is resisted. And it's also true that the right hemisphere is more able to see that opposition as something that does not need to be resolved into a unity, collapsed into unity, or one part of it discredited or eliminated, that it can live with both of these and therefore bring the true sense of a three-dimensional gestalt, where the left hemisphere has only a two-dimensional representation of all those things. And finally, of course, my interest in asymmetry. And of course, this is wonderful, because physics would have said, well, there's no real evidence of asymmetry, except I think I've mentioned before, I can't remember now what I've mentioned or not, but that both Pasteur in the 1860s, and then Pierre Curie in the 90s, the one a biologist, the other a physicist, made the point that the essential thing in both their realms is asymmetry. Without asymmetry, there could be no life, that life is a reflection of that asymmetry, according to Pasteur. And with Pierre Curie, that there may be symmetries in the cosmos, but they don't really matter. The only thing that matters is that there are asymmetries. And when we were discovering in the 20th century, I say we grandly, but great physicists were discovering the nature of the elementary particles, it was and forces, it was the asymmetry in the weak force that was discovered in the 50s and resulted in a Nobel Prize being given to Li and Chen Ning. Controversially, another physicist, a woman, Chen-Hsiung Wu, was instrumental in them reaching their conclusions that the cosmos is effectively asymmetrical. Because of her, realization that the weak force is asymmetrical. And she didn't get the Nobel Prize, but there we are.
Well,
gosh, we navigated something.
So are we ready for consciousness, Ian?
Oh my goodness me. Let's get some sleep. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very good.
Very good. Now that will be the next one, chapter 25, Matter and Consciousness. And look forward to talking with you about that. That may be a slightly longer one than usual, but anyway, we'll do what we can.
Yes, and a bit more.
And a bit more.
All right.
All right.
Thank you, Ian.
Thank you so much, Alex. Yes. Bye-bye.
Till then. Bye-bye.
Yeah.